Several of you mentioned, it's so interesting, you'd get up and you'd say, well, I'm not a journalist. Or I didn't go to journalism school. Everyone in here is a journalist. When you do this work and you do it for social purposes, for civic purposes, you are a journalist. It doesn't matter if you've been to journalism school. I would say in the US, half of the professional journalists have a journalism school education and half don't. Some people, I needed one because I didn't know the language. I didn't know kind of the culture of journalism because I didn't grow up in a family that understood that. My father was immigrant from Poland. So I needed to go to journalism school to understand the language and the terminology and the history, but a lot of the best journalists I've worked with have a specialty education in science or economics or philosophy or English, and then they learn the work on the job. I think the key is wanting to do the work for the right reasons. And what you said, Svetlana, is really interesting. You are at an exciting time. You have huge challenges here, because you don't have public records laws like we do. You don't have a constitution that protects you. You have a government, from what I understand, that is trying to tighten its controls on the press. And those are big, big challenges, but you also are young, and you get to create the future. You don't have anybody above you saying necessarily this is the way to do it. So you get to figure it out and say, we're going to find the way. And you're going to, and the internet, which is its own challenge, is also a big advantage, because you get to go to a new model and a new platform if you want to skirt around the existing places that you don't feel are doing it quite as the way you might think should be done in the U.S. We got hit hardest first. 3 things happened. One is the news industry did not anticipate the impact of the internet. And so when the internet was just getting started in the early 90s, a lot of newspaper owners and publishers went, who cares? And they sort of said, the argument was, well, radio came along and it didn't hurt us, and television came along and it didn't hurt us, and the internet is just a passing fad. It's a different thing. What they didn't anticipate was not only did the internet create a new revolution for how people get information, so people can bypass the press and get their information directly, or so they think, but it also cut 60 to 80% of our ad base. Craigslist, you have Craigslist here? Do you know what Craigslist is? Craigslist is an interesting online, very, very low budget, low rent online advertising site where, let's say I want to sell my car, and instead of going to the newspaper, which I used to, and putting an ad in the newspaper to sell my car, I now go on Craigslist and I say I live in Seattle, Washington area code 98201, and I have a car and I'm selling it, and here's a picture of it, and here's what I want for it, and call me up and we'll talk. So, and real estate ads, homes and renting and buying homes, job ads, employment ads, and car ads were the bulk of newspapers' ad revenue, and that went away because that went to Craigslist. Then the economy tanked at exactly the same time. And so not only were we hit by the internet disruption, but we were hit by a downturn in the overall economy. So unemployment and housing market failed. Job market and housing market failed, which means we lost those ads and then they never came back. And then the third thing that was problematic is a lot of American media sites are traded on Wall Street. They're publicly owned companies and they're traded on Wall Street, which means the expectation, you guys should understand this, you cover economics, the expectation is that every year on Wall Street your profits and your dividends have to go up. And so newspapers were used to making anywhere between 20 and 40% profits, and they can't sustain that. And if they can't sustain that, Wall Street gets mad, and Wall Street starts pushing pressure on them. So the newspaper company I worked for, which was called Knight Ridder, has since collapsed, and it's now McClatchy. My newspaper stock, which is we got paid our bonuses in stocks, my newspaper stock when I left the newspaper in 1994 was worth $85 a share. It's now worth $2.10. That's money out of my pocket I'll never get back, but that's money an entire company failed. So there were three things that, it's the perfect storm. There were three things that all happened at once. And they're not coming back. And so newspapers and news organizations generally are trying to find new ways to make revenues, and they can't replicate in the digital age the relationship that they used to have with advertisers where they said, we'll get your advertisers in front of all these eyeballs. We'll deliver this product, and you can put your ads in it, but you have to give us a lot of money. So I think the average ratio, and I don't know about magazines, but in newspapers, 80 to 90% of the revenue came from advertising, not from subscriptions. And what is it in magazines?
A little less, but still very high.
Yeah.
And that's maybe peculiar to the U.S. market.
Right.
It's not true so much of most European. The other thing that might be a little bit different in the U.S. is the other trend that the Internet unleashed was it made the U.S. a much more national market than it had been. There were all these regional papers. There used to be many more regional banks, for instance. They were like, when I was at that newspaper I mentioned 40 years ago, there were 30,000 banks in the U.S. with individual companies, not just branches, that had their own boards of directors, their own officers. And that all started to change back then. And now there are like, 6,000 or something. A lot of branches still, but not the same. Not the same as having the board of directors, all the vice presidents, and so with all these regional papers, they, as Jacqui said, they kind of had little local monopolies on advertising. Right. Like if you wanted to, reach people in a market, you had to go to them. Not true anymore. In addition to Craigslist, which is a big deal in the U.S., there's like eBay, which also made it possible to sell things online. There are many
Amazon,
yeah, and things like restaurant reviews. All the things you used to go to a local newspaper for are now can be done nationally or sort of franchised nationally.
Right.
So that's a way that market has changed, and it's easy to to look at the owners and say they're short-sighted and stupid, which is true. They were. They had a very protected, very fat market for a long time. They were used to those very high returns, to 20% and more, and very respectable business. I'm a newspaper publisher, and they didn't spend a lot of time looking at the future. But if you look at the history of business and at management theory, which especially if you write about companies is something you might want to do. You find that's basically true throughout the history of capitalism. There's a great series of books by a guy named Clayton Christensen. I can send you his name, called The Innovator's Dilemma. I don't know if you've seen that. Innovator's Dilemma. And then there's like The Innovator's Conundrum. I forget. He's done like 3 or 4. And he looked back at like major innovations in business, and basically the consistent fact is that the incumbent companies, the ones who control a market, are never the ones who see the next thing coming.
Right.
It always happens. It happened like computer disk drives in the 70s and 80s. It happened with computers themselves. In the U.S., it's a big deal in retailing, for instance. First there were little stores, then there were department stores, and then the department stores were killed by what we call big box stores. Is that a familiar term? Big box category killers. Warehouse stores where they have just a big. What are they called here?
Do you have IKEA here?
Hypermarkets. Okay, hypermarkets. Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, in the U.S., a bunch of companies came along and did that for every market, like.
Right.
Barnes & Noble did it with books, and another company called Borders that you might not have heard of. They set up these giant bookstores, like 40,000 square feet, thousands of titles, killed all the local bookstores. It happens in industry after industry. So, the fact that journalism didn't, especially daily newspaper and magazine journalism in the U.S., didn't understand the way the market was changing is typical.
Right.
And that's what we call a secular decline, one going on over time, not a cycle. And we don't know quite where that that's ending yet. It may be kind of ending, but it may not be over yet. And sort of on that long secular decline of jobs, due to these changing forces of the market, you have the cycle, of recession and depression, and along with the cycle of growth and recession, there's an accompanying cycle of advertising spending, which is true of online advertising as well. When there's a recession, people stop advertising or they cut back. It's one of the first things, if you're a business manager, it's one of the things you can actually control. Like, if the market's looking bad and your profits are weakening, what can you do? Well, you can fire people, right, which they do, But that has long-term costs, It costs money to fire people and to hire them back then, when you need them. But advertising, you can just, you call up your ad guy and say, cut the ad budget by 20%. So advertising always plunges, in the early stages of recession. So in addition to this long-term decline, we've seen the cyclical ups and downs in the market. And in my career, it was starting in 1980, I've seen at least 5 cycles like that. The one that I talked about before when I started, then, there's been one every 5 or 6 years basically since then where, the newspapers and magazines and now internet companies, stop hiring when things are uncertain. And then it takes them a while before they start hiring again. They get kind of gun shy. That's the word we have. They're tentative, They're not sure the recession is over. They're not sure they can hire people. It takes a long time. So like in the 90s, there was a recession in 90 or 91. Not a bad recession, kind of routine in the U.S., but all the journalism companies stopped hiring people. And they weren't sure that recession was really over until like 95 or 96, even though the recession had ended in months, And I remember at Time Inc. back then at Fortune, we were, we had a hiring freeze. It was like, don't add staff, And then in the late 90s, we had the internet boom. The stock market went crazy, and a bunch of new publications started. And all of a sudden, we went from not hiring anybody to hiring anybody.
Right. And hiring badly.
Yeah, hiring badly. Yeah. And, offering people lots of money. And then we had the recession in 2000, and then they fired all the people they hired in the late 90s. Yeah. So there are a couple of things going on. Kinds of people who own newspapers in America in the past tended to be, there were a few who were kind of, idealists who were like journalistic purists, like the family that owns the New York Times, the Sulzbergers. They could have made a lot more money if they'd done something else, And there are several other companies that are owned by people like that who had an interest in journalism first. Like there's the people who own Vanity Fair, the Newhouses. They owned a bunch of newspapers, and they had a pretty good reputation for leaving the newspapers alone. But they recently. Yeah. Sort of like
they're gutting them.
Yeah, they're gutting them and sort of joined the trend.
Right.
And there is concern in the future. Like right now, there's a chain of regional newspapers that's up for sale, including like the Los Angeles Times, which is maybe the most prestigious regional paper in the country.
And that happened when the chain, which was the Tribune Company, was bought by our version of an oligarch, a very rich real estate developer named Sam Zell, who hated the press. He hated the press. So right before the economic collapse, he bought the Tribune Company. He's based in Chicago, and the Chicago Tribune was one of the flagships. Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, I think Hartford Courant, a few other papers. And he bought it because he said, I hate you guys, so I'm going to own you guys. And then the big joke was the economy collapsed and he lost all his money on the newspaper. And Sam Zell just thought he'd make money forever because he always did. So now he's basically dividing up the papers and trying to sell them off, and it's been bad. There's a little history here to realize. We do have those issues in the United States. And Rob's kind of lesson of history is important, but it's also important to realize, so Sulzbergers and the Newhouses and people like that were doing the idealistic thing. The newspaper industry in the U.S. really got launched by two guys named Pulitzer and Hearst. and they had very, very political agendas. And they bought newspapers to foment their political agenda. So these guys weren't idealists. They were in cahoots with whatever businesses and whatever politicians they believed in. And historically, newspapers were often in bed with politicians. And you could read a newspaper politically one way or another. The difference in the U.S. is that we have laws and a constitution that protect a free press and require the press to stay separate from government to a certain extent. And that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And that's a gift that we have. The other thing, though, that you guys have the possibility to do is what I saw happen in the U.S. over the years was that the public started demanding good journalism. And the journalists started providing it. So the Pulitzers and the Hearsts and the corrupt people got brought along by a public saying, we want the truth. We want the press to be on our side, not on some government official side. You guys might be at a place, your generation in your country, because you are a new country in many ways, right? Old history, but in many ways you're launching a new phase for Ukraine where you can start being part of the same thing, where if you find a way to offer good independent journalism to readers, they will find you because you will be the voice that they trust when they don't trust the people who are trying to influence them. I do a lot of work in China, and the Chinese struggle with this all the time because the government owns all the newspapers in China, and the government can tell the newspapers what to do. So remember SARS? Do you remember SARS, the big virus infection that was going around about 10 years ago? The Chinese government basically wouldn't let the newspapers write that SARS existed. And editors would get fired if they wrote about SARS. But they always got fired for financial malfeasance, right? The Chinese government said they were cooking the books. Well, what happened was over time, with the internet, the public started pushing back. And so now that in China, of all places, I see more and more and more newspapers having an independent voice because the public's demanding it. And there are also all these interesting little startups where newspapers, people are saying, well, we're going to start our own publication and we're not going to worry about the government. And it's hard, but they're doing it. But it's got to be a sustained movement. You can't expect to go from A to Z. You got to go through all of those other steps. It's tough stuff. We want to do to kind of set the tone for everything you do is really get to that notion of impact and power and why we do this. Remembering why we do what we do, the purpose behind it is absolutely essential when things get hard. When you're not making enough money, when your boss is a jerk, when you don't know, like you get the owner is trying to tell you to shut down, you got to remember why you do this, and you've got to believe that it matters. And over the course of a career, you're going to go up and down on that. You're going to have moments when it's hard to remember, why do I do this? I could be making more money doing something else. It's hard to know. Some of you said you want to know how you affect change in society. It's really hard to know with journalism how you affect change. There are some stories that immediately change laws. There's some stories, investigative stories in the U.S., where you can see the connection between the story and the change. But most stories, I think, are more like dropping a pebble into the ocean. And who knows where the waves land on shore. So you just got to trust that if you put the right kind of stories out there and you really care about those readers and you care about the public and you care about your country, it will find a way to make change. But that means you got to hold that inside. I want you to think about a piece of journalism, a story, that had personal power for you. It can be a story you worked on, you did, or it can be a story you read, a story you saw on TV. But just take 30 seconds, each of you alone, and then I'm going to pair you up, to think about a time when journalism made a difference in your life. Maybe it's a story your parents told about something. I mean, I mentioned to you that I was sitting in Antarctica when the Berlin Wall fell, and I was with people from like 7 or 8 different countries, and we had a shortwave radio, and I sat in a hut in Antarctica, freezing, crying as hard as I could because I was listening to a reporter from BBC tell me that the wall was coming down. huge in my generation because I grew up with that wall, and I grew up with the scare of communism. You know, we were taught to hide under desks because the evil red forces were going to come and rape us or something. I don't know. And so there's stories that I think back on. I still remember, you probably do too, Rob, the day that Walter Cronkite, who was the reigning news anchor, told the world that John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And he stopped in the middle of his news report, and he had to take off his glasses and wipe his eyes because he was getting very, very emotional. Remember the day that I was watching TV and we saw Robert Kennedy get assassinated on television. Those are stories that have had power for me, and I've worked on a lot of stories that have had personal power. They have literally changed my life. They have opened up the world to me. They've helped me understand something differently. They were part of teaching me history. So take a little time and think about a time or piece of journalism that had power for you. It can be little, it can be big.